Creativity and a learning mindset are essential to succeed. Learn how these innovators put these skills to use to become the best in their fields. Welcome to Innovators to Know, brought to you by IdeaMix.
Elise Hu is a broadcast journalist who joins us today. She hosts the TED Talks Daily podcast, one of my favorites,
Great.
and is a host at large for NPR. Elise spent 12 years at NPR, appearing regularly on a variety of different shows, and she's filed stories from more than a dozen countries as an international correspondent. She also opened NPR's first ever bureau in Seoul, Korea. In 2009, she helped found the Texas Tribune, a nonprofit digital startup. She graduated from the University of Missouri-Columbia and won the National Edward R. Murrow and DuPont Columbia Awards, among others. She has an exciting new book coming out later this year, which we're excited to talk about on the show.
Yay.
Elise, welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to have this conversation.
Elise, in introducing you, what didn't I say, or what would you like to add?
Oh, gosh. You didn't mention that I'm a mother. I have 3 small children who are 5, 7, and 10. So that consumes a lot of my energy and my sort of emotional workload. What else?
So important to mention. Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up because so many of our listeners are moms.
Yes,
and
so
they know exactly what the juggle's like.
Yes, that's a big part of my identity. I mean, there's lots of quirkier things about me that I guess I identify with. Maybe not quirky, but just big identity points. Like I'm from Texas. I grew up from Texas. And those of us from there like to say, you know, it's the best country in America. So
those of you from Texas wear it with pride, which I love.
That's right. There's a lot of Texas exceptionalism. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure that we'll cover lots of ground in this conversation, but I think kind of the big thing that we miss when we talk about when our bios get presented is sort of our relational life, right? Like you hit a lot of the things that I've done with my career, but some of the hardest work that I've had to do in becoming an adult and now being an adult is just relational work, right? Like becoming a mother, being a wife, all of those sorts of things.
I'm so glad you brought that up because one of the things I really wanted you to talk about was your decision to become a journalist. It's often hard in that profession to have sort of a personal life at the beginning because you're in lots of different places. And in a way, it's easier to do, I guess, when you're single. But tell us a little bit about your decision around entering journalism, studying it first, entering it, and then how you've transitioned through these various stages of evolution in your life.
Oh, gosh. That's a big question. I can answer the origin question most directly, which is I decided I wanted to be a journalist when I was 8 years old. I was fortunate at the time to be at a school district that had a separate kind of learning opportunity for kids who were kind of tested in to be considered intellectually gifted. And now I know it's kind of up for debate whether kids should even be qualified in that way, but or classified in that way. But if you did kind of meet the standard for whatever gifted was at the time, you got bused to a different campus one day of the week, starting in 2nd or 3rd grade, I think 3rd grade. And it was called the Center for Creative Learning. And there kids were kind of taught in all the new pedagogies, like all the new ways and the new sort of research-backed ways to teach kids, instead of what you were traditionally getting and trying to hit the Common Core type milestones and markers of.
So a very progressive school.
Yeah, it was far more progressive. And in the afternoons, kids could kind of choose their classes, and the classes would be things like the 1992 Democratic presidential primary, like that was a class for a semester, or crawfish was a class, or building a computer from scratch was one. But then in the mornings, the entire class of kids that you were put in with in your grade had a semester-long focus, and we had a semester-long focus of broadcast news. And so the class kind of learned all the roles of a newsroom, what went into a newscast. And by the end, we put together a 30-minute newscast for public access. And that's how I got introduced to broadcast journalism. And then I felt, and even at that time as a child, I felt like this really aligns with my soul, sort of the essence of who I am. And I feel so fortunate to have found that kind of alliance and have been introduced to it so young. But I knew then that I wanted to be a journalist. And then by 7th grade, I decided I wanted to focus in political journalism. I thought that civics kind of had the greatest impact on our lives. And so 10 years later, when I was out of school and in journalism, I ended up being a political journalist, sort of what I wanted to do.
Fantastic. It's a great story. So many people struggle to find these passions in their lives. And you were very fortunate in a sense to find it quite early and be at a place where you could really pursue it and kind of give it a real voice, even very young in your journey, to then sort of really fall in love with it.
Right. And I don't think you have to. I mean, there's plenty of folks who decide in their 30s or in their 40s, like, this is what I want to do. And that alignment happens. I don't think that it's better or worse at what point you find your alignment. But I do think as humans, we should, as much as possible, kind of figure out what most lines up with the core of who we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to show our audience the trailer that you created for your NPR show, Future You, with Elise Hu. I love the rhyming. Let's take a quick look.
Hey y'all, it's Elise Hu. You might remember me from trying things across Asia to unpack the culture behind them, like K-pop dance, pour vacuuming.
Oh dear. Oh geez.
And
Thickened white wine. Gotta give it a whirl.
well, now I'm back in the States and I'm trying the future. Our first season dives into the superhuman possibilities for our brains and bodies. We'll explore how technology is already changing what it means to be human and where it'll take us by 2050. So if you're wondering, will we be able to engineer immortality or communicate telepathically or download new skills straight into our brains? Come along. We're calling it Future You with Elise Hu. And that's me, Elise Hu.
Elise, I think you were living in Asia at that time. Is that right?
I had just come back. I had just come back from Asia, and I wanted to find kind of a soft landing from what I had been doing. I had been covering a lot of missile strikes, or missile tests, I should say, that North Korea was launching into the sea, and then one time threatened to launch into Guam. And there was a lot of diplomacy, or shuttle diplomacy, happening the year that I came back, and when South Korea was hosting the Olympics, the Winter Games. And so I needed something that sort of was more long-term or considered things at a longer-term scale. And so I created this video show and this beat for myself, which was the future, in which we looked at sort of where humans were going to be and where the planet was going to be in 2050. And that allowed for a lot more imagination, allowed for testing things that were far, far, far out ahead instead of kind of just the news of the day. And it was a nice break. It was a nice breather after I got back.
So why Korea? How did you end up going to Korea?
Really on a whim.
Okay.
This is more of an NPR sort of management directive than anything that I had personally asked to do. I remember I was living in Washington and I had one child at the time. I had a 2-year-old, and I had been in Washington, D.C. for 4 years. And for those listeners who are from D.C. or have spent any time there, they know kind of the culture of D.C. is very workaholic. It's very sort of workist. And I could sort of see my future. I think I was like, gosh, I just turned 30 and I was sort of seeing my future at the time. I was like, oh gosh, 10, 15, 20 years from now, if I stay in Washington, we're going to have a house in Bethesda and I'm going to be hosting these book parties for a bunch of congressional staffers. And I will have been doing that same thing in Washington in my comfy and cush suburban Maryland life for decades or a decade plus. And I didn't want that. I knew that I still had a lot of restlessness in me and a lot of wanderlust. And what I wanted to do as a journalist was to be kind of far flung for a long time. And so I went to the bosses at NPR and sort of asked whether there were opportunities for assignments as far away as possible, that I just wanted to be somewhere else. And again, that was just like a tugging of something sort of deep inside me. And luckily, there were management had already been talking for a couple of years about closing the Afghanistan Bureau, which existed at the time, and opening up a new bureau in Northeast Asia, which didn't have any coverage. We have correspondents in Beijing, in Shanghai, in India, in Southeast Asia, but we didn't have somebody in Northeast Asia. And so they proposed this bureau that would be based in Seoul, but that would cover North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. And I had never been to Korea. I had never so much as had a layover at Incheon Airport, which is the airport outside of Seoul. But I was interested in Japan. You know, Japanese culture had always fascinated me, and I knew a little bit more about it, I think. And so I was like, great, that sounds good. When can I go? There was obviously an interview process, but the idea itself was seeded by management.
Fantastic. You took the leap, and we'll circle back to this in a bit, but it also deeply informs your book, due to come out later this year. So it was obviously a very, very formative time.
It sure was. It also, I can't believe so much happened in a short amount of time. I was ultimately in Seoul and covering Korea and Japan for only, less than 4 years, a little bit less than 4 years. But the news on that beat was constant. It was ceaseless, relentless, really. And then I had 2 babies while I was over there too. So I had moved when I was like 4 or 5 months pregnant. I went on maternity leave for 8 weeks each. I birthed that bureau and I birthed 2 babies. And, you know, it was a lot, and I was constantly traveling. I think I was on the plane, or I was away from home like 40% of the time. So often the babies would travel with me, or my breast pump would. And so I've pumped like in every airport in Northeast Asia, and had to talk my milk through these security agents who were utterly confused about what was happening and why. I was like, I can't get rid of it. No.
It's amazing. You'd think they encounter enough pregnant women to know that the milk is of paramount concern.
But yeah,
I remember those days of lugging my breast pump around too.
Yeah, man. And I was always rushing around because news breaks, you know, and you go somewhere else. But I missed some stories too. There was this major earthquake in Nepal just after the point in 2015 when I couldn't travel. Yeah. And so I didn't get to go like camping at a disaster zone in Nepal because of that. But there were some things like that
trade-offs, always. Child, earthquake in Nepal. Right. Apart from your work at the NPR, you also host a couple of business podcasts. Will you tell our listeners a little bit about the work you do?
Sure. So obviously the flagship podcast for TED has a lot of business topics. So I'm the host of TED Talks Daily, and that started in April of 2020. So just after we were all in lockdown land. And I'm very proud of that because it's an opportunity to watch a lot of TED Talks and grow and be confronted with new ideas constantly. And so I love that. But I've also, in the last couple of years, taken on roles hosting for Microsoft and Accenture. And Microsoft and Accenture play well together, too. I think one is a client of the other. And so in both podcasts, and the formats are different, but in both podcasts, we ask kind of questions about the direction that work is going, the direction that corporate America and the global corporate world is going in terms of larger trends, how they're relating with the workforce, how the pandemic has really shifted everything beneath our feet.
Fascinating. Yeah. I mean, such important topics and will continue to be so key as our work situations as a society continue to evolve, right? Coming out of the pandemic, different economic conditions, different generations, all coming together in our workplaces.
Yeah, so much more is required from leaders these days, right? Like, because organizations are tasked with adapting to change very quickly, but also labor force that is really demanding a lot more. Like the labor force is no longer okay with just saying like, oh yeah, I'll do that. You know, I'll work weekends or I'll work overtime without commensurate pay, or I'll work without a union or union protection, or I'll put up with that sort of quiet abuse or quiet abusive treatment or abusive power, by my managers and bosses. And so I think leaders are really having to adapt to being far more human.
Yeah.
And thank God, because we can't continue working in the sort of hustle culture mentality that has really governed so much of my work life, for sure.
Well, I think we were all sort of burning out, both as individuals as well as societies and companies collectively, right? And I think the pandemic, I guess, was a sharp realization that was afflicting sort of everybody. But as you said, I think leadership is more and more challenging because as companies grow, in particular, on the one hand, you're solving for a set of organizational goals and needs, and at the same time, you're really trying to treat people as individuals, right? Because they will no longer stand for being sort of treated as a mass and expected to do sort of whatever the company lays down.
Right.
And it's hard because it's sort of, it requires this like very multifaceted approach. And that's in addition to sort of the day job of thinking about the business and running it and making decisions in it. There's a whole people aspect to how do you tackle and treat people as individuals, respecting their talents, creating environments for them to thrive.
Right, exactly. Because we're really not coming together horizontally just to complete a task, right? Like if you are coming together just to complete a task, like, like harvest this particular crop, let's just say in agriculture, or hey, we need to build this one thing. And then after we build this one project, then we can all come apart. That is very different than what companies are asking, because companies are asking that you kind of commit yourself to a series of projects or a series of tasks. And in that sense, I think that workers then need a lot more purpose and a lot more meaning from work. Sort of, I'm not just doing this, for a paycheck. I'm doing this because it gives me something to believe in that's greater than myself. And that requires leadership to really know its own values and and be able to honor the people that kind of come to work every day. And so that's a big theme that comes across in both the Microsoft conversations I've had and the Accenture stories I've told.
Absolutely. I think what you're highlighting is, one, the nature of work that we do in our advanced economies is quite different, and it's constant, right? It's not seasonal or project based. It's basically constant, and it's a series of these projects, sprints, collaborations, whatever they need to be. And each of those is sort of a multidimensional hydra in the sense that it isn't, just it's April and we got to show up and pick the stuff that's grown in the field. And there isn't that sort of structure or dictate that everyone has to collaborate around. We have to sort of define the dictates that everybody will collaborate around. And that makes it doubly difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. So this means there's endless podcast conversations about this type of thing, right? Like I really love another podcast in the TED Audio Collective, Work Life, from Adam Grant. Adam Grant is a behavioral psychologist at Wharton, and he does a really great job of reading all the white papers and kind of condensing it and metabolizing it for us, and then making it, bringing the insights to life in conversations. So if that's a podcast that your listeners aren't familiar with yet, I definitely recommend it.
I love that podcast. Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. So you have a new book coming out this year.
I do.
Tell us a little bit about it.
I'm so excited to talk about it. It is called Flawless Lessons in Looks and Culture from the K-Beauty Capital. That K-Beauty Capital is, of course, Seoul, South Korea, where I was based for nearly 4 years. And the book is part memoir, it's part journalism, and it's part social commentary about the beauty culture at large. So you're all probably familiar, especially at the start of this new year, of diet culture. So this idea that, our bodies are endless projects to be worked on, and that you want to get your body back after pregnancy, or you want to get your body into its most optimized state. Beauty culture is sort of another strain of it. and maybe kind of the umbrella of diet culture in that it includes your body, but also your skin and your face. And it's sort of this idea that, we are constantly, how visual culture, the bombardment of images that we face on social platforms and advertisements and in pop culture today kind of inform this need for us to constantly fix ourselves. And then we're also sold by the industry this notion that, hey, there's something about you that could be fixed, and here you should spend some money to fix it. It's kind of a book that talks about this and then uses Korea as a jumping off point to ask a larger question about where we draw the line when it comes to perpetually improving or our appearance or trying to freeze it in time, to look youthful or thinner or firmer or smoother.
Do you think that this emphasis on aesthetic, it's constant self-improvement, constant self-evaluation, is it different in different parts of the world, or do you find it fairly consistent throughout?
I thought it was most extreme in South Korea because the society doesn't give you much of a choice. Work life is organized around looks. The marriage market is organized around looks. It is a place where headshots are required on resumes. You put height and weight in the same way for jobs in the government. Thankfully, they banned that just a few years ago. But whether you're applying for an accounting job or an acting job, you have to have your height and your weight and your headshot. And these headshot and your passport photos are photoshopped by default. So it's a place where looks mattered in an extreme way.
And we're woven into every aspect of the culture, from what you're saying.
That's right. And there was really not a lot of choice about conforming to it. When it came to plastic surgery, the most popular surgeries, things like cutting a double eyelid, so you have that fold, that epicanthic fold over your eye. It wasn't really a matter of choice whether you got these plastic surgeries, because in a lot of cases, everybody else was doing it. And so if you wanted a leg up, or even to just be on the level playing field as everyone else, it was not really a choice. It wasn't really a matter of choice. And so I get into questions about that and where we draw the line when it comes to aesthetic self-improvement, right? Like when it is possible, when it is less medically invasive to, have a creaseless forehead or have a bigger bum or whatever it is, and you don't have to go under the knife for it anymore. And it's less expensive, because that's another huge difference between the West and the East. It's far, far, far cheaper to get Botox and get other injections and surgeries. So when cost isn't a problem and technology makes everything smaller and lighter and less invasive, then where do we draw the line? Where do we say, I don't want to become a cyborg or something that is akin to a cyborg?
Right. And did you find that this culture was pretty specific to women, or does it also sometimes spill over to men?
13% of all men's skincare products in the world are consumed by South Korean men.
Wow.
And South Korea is a population that is quite small. I mean, it's like 50 million people. Yeah. The entire country could fit in the space between Los Angeles and San Francisco. It's not a large country. But
and that's a lot of skincare.
Yes, the men are subsumed by beauty culture as well. And I don't know if that's necessarily equality when all of us are kind of losing our choice of whether to participate.
Totally. Fascinating. I can't wait to see the book.
Yep, it's called Flawless, out in May. But you can pre-order now. I'm very excited. So for the listeners who are interested, you can just Google my name and the name of the book and find it to pre-order.
Fantastic. So let's shift gears a little bit in this last question, Elise. Tell us about the role that coaching and mentorship has played in your life and career. I mean, as you know, at DMX, we're all about coaching.
Yeah.
How has it been important for you? Have you ever worked with a coach? Who do you view as your key mentors throughout your time?
I think teachers really form the backbone of my career. and who I've become as a human being. So I guess my teachers have been my mentors, or my mentors are teachers in various ways. I feel like in the work world, there are really, really formative relationships with folks who were largely in positions of power, who could kind of block and tackle, when it came to having opportunities or finding opportunities for me, but also who kind of saw me and were able to kind of give me extra time and energy and take me under their wing. There's a lot of folks who are thanked in my book, for example, because they have, and a lot of them are my teachers. They have really supported me throughout. And like one of the most formative mentors in my life is my professor from college in broadcast journalism named Stacey Wolfel, who I think kind of saw my passion for broadcast news and just politics and news in general very early, before I was even in the journalism program, and allowed me to kind of come in and have some opportunities to intern or to work, essentially just like work for free and shadow people and learn the ropes, and was also sort of expansive in his imagination for what I could do, and in ways that I maybe didn't even see for myself, right? And I think that that's something that the best mentors kind of do for you, right? We are really hard on ourselves.
Especially as women.
Yes. But then I feel like my mentors have given me license or given me permission to sort of think bigger, and not be limited by my own kind of self-criticism or imagination. So Stacey is really important. A lot of teachers earlier on in my life, even kind of in elementary school and on, I would consider mentors. In my career, there's a few folks who we had a good chi. I come from Chinese culture, right? This idea of chi, or like the Force, in Star Wars land. Like, we just had a good kind of connection. And my mentors are never from like formal mentorship programs, though I'm supportive and I participate in them. They end up kind of happening organically, because they were the folks who hired me or tried to hire me. Like one of my close friends and mentors is a former editor at the Washington Post whose job offer I turned down. And that was kind of a fork in the road. But then he, to this day, he showed up at my 40th birthday party last year. He to this day remains a really good friend and mentor. And he came to visit me in Seoul and all these things, even though I didn't take the job. So every sort of juncture and collision with another person is an opportunity to find a really strong mentor and mentee relationship. And I should also mention that they don't go one way, right? Like, I've learned so much from the people who I mentor.
Yeah.
And in so many ways, it's like, who's the mentor, who's the mentee? And so I do want to emphasize, as we're talking about this, that it's kind of a fluid relationship, because so many intergenerational friendships and mentor relationships really, you assume that the older person is the wiser one, but not always so, and not necessarily at all. There's a woman that I mentor who I call a sister from another mother. They're named Kat Chow, who's also an author and a journalist. And she's got to be a decade younger than me, but I'm constantly going to her for advice and going to her for wisdom, and kind of just using her as an ear to bounce things off of. And it happens really both ways. And so that's kind of like the big takeaway that I've learned from a lot of these relationships. They are so foundational and crucial, and they come in unexpected ways. It's not necessarily something that a relationship that will come from a program or kind of formal networking.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think, based on your own experience and that of many others who've been on this show, my own experience very much mirrors this. It requires an openness to these relationships, because it's unclear as you initiate them, or even while you're in them, exactly where they're going to go, right? And that only becomes revealed with time. And as you said, the successful relationships are two-way. It isn't just one way. And I think what people seeking mentors often don't think about is that mentors are seeking that kind of relationship for whatever reasons, and expect it to help them learn in unexpected ways as well. And they're equally rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. And like anything else, there are relationships, right? So you have
Yes.
to work at them. You have to kind of like prioritize them, right? And nurture them and steward them as well. I think it's important that we remember to kind of check in, and even when it's not particularly, when you don't even have an ask, right? When you don't have an ask, because that's what the nature of good relationships are all about.
100%. Wonderful. Any last words of advice, Elise, as we wrap up?
Yeah, something that I've been thinking about a lot is just the importance of biasing for action. So one of the greatest kinds of regrets that I spent a lot of last year sort of reading and learning about regret, because I was interviewing an author who's written a book about it, Daniel Pink. And the big takeaway that is always at the top of my mind now is to bias for action, because he did this worldwide study of regret, a survey of 20,000 people and their greatest regrets. And regret is really useful because you can kind of use it to see your values. But the kind that I don't want to have is the kind that's sort of the what if.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can really extinguish the what if regret by
acting.
Action, by doing it, right? Like there's so many things that you cannot understand, or experiences that you cannot have unless you do them. And even if you do them and it's not the result or the outcome that you desire, at least you've extinguished the sort of, well, if only question. So something that I'm going to be talking about a lot this year and on is just to kind of do it. Just try it.
Yeah. Great words of advice. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a delight to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe wherever you listen and leave us a review. Find your ideal coach at www.theidmx.com. Special thanks to our producer, Martin Maluski, and singer-songwriter Doug Allen.